Hello, Lakeview family. As you can tell, a little different background this week. I'm in Spokane. So, visiting family, Melissa's family is all up here in Spokane. So, we are here for the week. I'm recording this on Tuesday. I believe that is the day. Uh, but excited for this Sunday and excited for what we can learn together. And there's a real unique connection with this week's passage. Matthew 25 is where we find ourselves in the text. And this Sunday, if you follow along, and I'll explain a little bit more on Sunday, but if you follow along with kind of how with our rhythm of Sundays, it is Christ the King Sunday. So this is the final Sunday of the liturgical church year. So we kind of follow this church year, which is sequenced in 3 years, years A, B, and C. And this year we're finishing up year C. And we find ourselves with Christ the King Sunday. Next Sunday, it will be the first Sunday of Advent, which begins the church year every year. So we go Advent, then we have the Epiphany, which celebrates and kind of talks about the way in which God is revealed primarily through the birth of Christ. We see with the visitation of the Magi, so with all the world, Christ is revealed to the world. We talk about this as Epiphany. And then there's Sundays after Epiphany, which leads to Lent, which leads us to Easter, which leads to then Pentecost, and then kind of what's called ordinary time, which then takes us right up until this Sunday, which is Christ the King Sunday. And it provides this beautiful tension that exists, and we see it specifically in our text. So we're talking about Christ as King, which typically we think about Christ returning and reigning and ruling. So you have this idea of Christ as coming again, and then you also have this reality of Christ who has come and is always present. So there's this tension, which I love tension, that exists, and we see it specifically in this passage because Christ is present in the least of these. And in this passage, it talks about, the idea of judgment being what we have done to the least of these, which is where Christ is present. So we have Christ has come and is present, but Christ always also came and ascended and will come again. So we live in this tension-filled world, this mystery of Jesus. And I love that. And I especially love this text today. It's a unique one, and in some ways it's a tough one because it's confronting us this idea of judgment. So in Matthew, these last few, in chapters like 23, 24, 25, we get kind of Matthew's view of kind of the end time or the coming kingdom of this kind of eschatology, which is a fancy word for kind of a study of the things of the end. And Matthew's perspective is pretty unique, and it culminates in this story of the law or the least of these. And I love this story. And so Matthew's eschatology, or his kind of understanding of the kind of the end times or the judgment that is coming, which is real, and we recognize that. But his way of talking about it is very descriptive, right? It's describing the kinds of things that will happen, and it is not prescriptive. And I think a lot of scripture's conversations about what will happen at the end is very descriptive. And I think in a lot of ways we can tend to read into it. We want to know exactly how things will play out. And so we want to have this kind of prescriptive way of looking at it, what is exactly going to happen so that we can predict. Matthew's always also very clear that not even the Son knows. So if you rewind from chapter 25 into the previous chapters, there's a lot of conversations about kind of the coming end and the judgment and when the king returns or when the master returns. And the stories are fascinating. And most of them talk about simply preparation. In Matthew, if you look at the whole of Matthew's gospel, it's really all about discipleship. It's about being a disciple. And when you're reading this, especially from the lens, this Matthew 25, this lens of kind of mercy, right? And who shows up and what is happening, it connects very well to all of what Matthew is writing about in terms of his perspective on Jesus' life and ministry and teaching. And it really connects with the Beatitudes. You see that show up in this passage when those who are, the separation of the sheep and the goats, when those who are identified as sheep, it is those who literally embodied the message of Jesus as he has taught and modeled from his life and teachings and ministry, from the Sermon on the Mount, and the ways in which he calls the disciples and subsequently all of us to be like him, to be like Jesus. And as I mentioned, this is really about the idea of mercy, of showing up for the other, for the least, in ways that just recognizes their plight and their position and responds in love and responds as Jesus would respond. Now, one of the things I love the most about this passage for both the sheep and the goats, they were unaware. They had no idea. So both of them respond, both groups respond. When were you hungry? When were you naked and we gave you clothes? When were you lonely and in prison and we visited you? When was this? I don't even remember. And so from those who are the sheep, who are seen as righteous, who responded correctly, it was like this, oh my goodness, how did I miss? Did I do okay? Like, did I show you love? Like, oh, I didn't even know. Like, no one told me. But it's just kind of this like, kind of, what's the word I want to use? Like holy ignorance. Like they didn't even understand what was happening, but yet they responded. And Jesus is saying, man, you are righteous. I see you. And you responded in ways that were consistent with who I've called you to be. And then the same is true for the goats. They're like, why didn't you tell us? I would have totally been different. I would have responded differently had I known. I'm, almost like it's not my fault. And so they're both caught unaware. And I love this idea that it isn't about a belief. It's not about a confession, right? Being righteous in this passage, in this context, in this sequence for judgment, what Jesus is saying is it isn't about what you believe. It isn't about confessing the right things. It isn't even about saying my name. It's simply about responding to the least and recognizing that when you respond to these who are the least, you are responding to me. When you are showing mercy and being love to the least, you are showing mercy and being love to me. And that is what this kingdom is about. And this is probably hard for some of us. Personally, I love it. I think the emphasis on what we are about and who we are and how we love is so freeing and so beautiful and such a picture of who Jesus is. And it doesn't mean that we don't talk about what we believe. It doesn't mean that we don't have things like a right theology and perspective on things. It doesn't mean that we don't have a sense of like a standard of what it means to be holy. I mean, there's certainly, this is a part of the larger conversation that we see in Scripture, but do not miss this. Do not put more emphasis on the right prayer or saying the right things than responding in love, because this is the consistent theme throughout Scripture. And finally, probably what I love most about this passage is that this heart and essence has existed within the Lakeview body since way before I got here. And truthfully, in the ministry of Matthew 25, truthfully, that heart has existed from the beginning of this church, when it was first planted in 1927 as a mission outpost in North Nampa, oriented around the railroad, specifically designed for soup. As I've read historically, giving soup to people, as one place I read when I first got here talked about serving soup to hobos coming in on the train. The least. This passage talks, how we are then to live and who we are to be has been present in this local congregation since it was planted. And I love that. And may we never lose sight of that when we live in this way, when we show up and show mercy to the least, when we provide coffee at a table outside, when we give coats and clothes, when we provide a meal, when we simply show up and listen to those who God has brought to us, those who are parked in our parking lot, those who walk up during the week or on a Sunday, when we show up and provide a meal, provide conversation, provide clothing, provide a visit, that we're being Jesus. And those are the moments in which we see the kingdom in all of its reality. And when we recognize that we are being who Christ has called us to be. So I hope I hope you all have a great Thanksgiving. I hope you're all able to be present with your families. I know that is my vision and goal. And I look forward to unpacking this text a little bit more on Sunday and reminding us of who we're called to be. All right, church, have a blessed Thanksgiving, have a great week, and we'll see you Sunday.